Hello, and thank you for joining us. If you are just logging in, we're just going to give everyone a moment to be able to log in and set up their sound and everything, and we'll be starting that. Thank you. Hello again. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give everyone another minute or so to log in and get a chance to get set up. Thank you. All right. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Miro Consulting webinar on IBM Software Assumptions versus Audit Reality. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing and Lead Salesforce Analyst at Miro Consulting. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Presenting today will be Sharon Tremblay, Senior Analyst and IBM Practice Leader at Miro Consulting. She's been here at Miro for 9 years, and before that, she had worked at IBM for 10 years. Sharon also has degrees in computer science and IT management, a current PMI certification, and has attended Harvard Law's program on negotiation. Before we begin, I'll just how the control panel works and how we'll take questions. If you do have a question during our broadcast, please enter it as a text, as a chat box question, and we'll enter it. We will answer it at the end of the session. We'll take the questions in the order they're received, and when it's your turn to have your question asked, we will say the question, but we don't usually say the person's name asking it. You can find the chat window by clicking the little speech bubble icon on the gear in the control panel. It looks like a little white circle. All right, before we begin, just a little bit about Miro. I'd like to briefly explain who Miro is. We're the leading global provider of software asset management and subscription management services for Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, Salesforce, and now AWS. If you would like to save on your AWS costs, please contact us after the webinar so we can talk to you about that. We specialize in license management, audit advisory, negotiation tactics, support management, and cloud services. Our mission is to help our clients maximize their ROI on their software licenses and subscription investments, stay in compliance, and negotiate successful contracts and audit settlements. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sharon to please begin the presentation. Sharon?
Thanks, Sean. I think one of the first things that is important when you're dealing with IBM, they're very literal. Although, all your exceptions to their licensing rules should be in writing to present to their auditor, because they're going to need some proof rather than you recalling a conversation that you had at some point. And although it feels like you're guilty until you prove your innocence, the auditor's job is to find compliance issues and report findings to IBM. And then IBM's role in that audit is to negotiate a settlement based on those findings. The auditor can only base their findings on facts, the evidence they find of license entitlements and deployments. Although the auditee is given a chance to review the findings to clear up misunderstandings before the findings are submitted to IBM, many times the auditing company will ignore the feedback and send error-ridden or no annotations to IBM. So you're going to keep a running list of what's been cleaned up and what needs to be fixed. So don't be surprised if the auditor calculated deployments with license metrics you don't own, or ones that are not advantageous if you own multiple metrics. Let's say you own PVUs and RVUs, or PVUs and users. Sometimes they'll only just go for the PVUs or the RVUs and not consider everything you own. And then once the auditor has their draft findings together, they want to hand it off to IBM as soon as possible, because that's when their project is complete. They're very pushy to schedule that three-way handoff call, even ignoring legitimate feedback from you as the IBM customer, including math or spreadsheet errors. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that happens. So when we're talking about literally what IBM has asked you to do, if we look at the Passport Advantage Agreement, there's some critical information regarding IBM's expectations from its software customers. It's a 9-page document, but there's a lot of links in the end. So it's not that long. So if you want to check on your support or RSVP levels, that would be in that same document. But here's the sections that are important that may trip up IBM customers with regards to their software and auditing. And I'm going to drill down into the assumptions in the upcoming slides, but the important parts are section 1.12, compliance verification. That gives IBM the right to audit you, but also you have the responsibility to keep track of IBM's intellectual property in your environment. The next one is 1.13, programs in a virtualized environment. And because in that section, IBM says we could offer you subcapacity licensing methodology for use in virtualized environments for certain metrics. But that licensing is dependent upon your eligibility. So everybody by default is full capacity until you meet these terms. And then that gets into 1.14, the client's reporting responsibilities, where ILMT or another tool comes into effect, but only ILMT is mentioned there. One of the first is an assumption I've heard comes from a minority of international clients. I use Google Translate to confirm that the terms are relatively the same, is that the Passport Advantage Agreement in all these other languages are different than the English one. It's pretty much the same, that you need to use ILMT to get subcapacity, you need to keep track of IBM's intellectual property and deployments, and all the other terms that trip up IBM software customers are present in the other languages. Another assumption is a sales rep or reseller didn't mention anything about Passport Advantage or these terms, but maybe they did or they didn't, and they may have told someone else in your organization. It's not a strong defense, since it may have been conversations. I mean, if you call up a sales rep and say, hey, I need 140 PVUs of DB2, they sell it to you. If they're not confirming that you only need 140 and that you might need more, you might need less. They're just selling you what you asked for. And there may be something on your ordering document that says the Passport Advantage Agreement is applicable. So when the software is downloaded from IBM, there's also mention of Passport Advantage Agreement to use this software. So at the end of the day, when you're under an audit, and before that, it's up to your company to own the license entitlements you need in order to use IBM's intellectual property. Okay, another assumption is that if you have an ELA, it invalidates the Passport Advantage Agreement or eclipses it. In the beginning of your ELA, there's a housekeeping section that refers to other IBM agreements. It may also refer to previous customer-specific ELAs. For example, you were adding 3 years onto your previous agreement. So some of the terms in your new agreement will update those terms, but there may be a customized term that lingers going forward. But in that housekeeping section, they mention all the other IBM agreements that also apply. So unless your ELA modifies, some terminology from Passport Advantage, that agreement still dictates IBM's distributed software usage in your environment. An example of where it could supersede Passport Advantage is if you have an aggregate cap or software catalog in your ELA, you get to prepay to deploy anything off of a list of software included in your ELA, and you report that to IBM and draw down from your prepaid amount. Whereas the Passport Advantage Agreement says you are to purchase any licenses needed prior to deploying. But obviously, if you have prepaid funds, you'd use those first. The next assumption is ILMT doesn't apply to me. So this is section 1.14, client's reporting responsibilities, where there are exceptions to using ILMT. And some people think their organization is exceptional. So of course, that's where I stop reading, or I skim a little further and I think it applies to me. But you got to read carefully, because there's been a change in this latest version from 2017, which is now almost 5 years old, that if you have less than 1,000 employees and you have less than 1,000 PVUs of servers, you can use the exception. But in the past it was or, and 1,000 PVUs is only about 14 processor cores of an Intel box. So it's likely you would need to use the tool. And if you look where it starts on the next page, if you have the exception per this, you still need to manually manage the deployments where you're going to track it manually on a spreadsheet. And IBM provides a template, so there's no confusion over what you need to track. And they expect that to be done quarterly, like you do your ILMT reports. And a lot of people miss that goes on to the next page for the exception that they have to manually do something. It's not terrible to fill out that sheet, but there's enough data that it might, if your environment's pretty stagnant, it's not a big deal. But if it's constantly moving around, it may be better just to install the tool. Another assumption, also in that same section, is if you are not using an eligible virtualization environment or subcapacity product for ILMT. There's always new technology, and eventually it will get added to ILMT, so it can look at your environment to calculate how many PVUs or RVUs you need. And you don't really see this often, that you don't have what ILMT can read, but remember that the manual reporting pieces for this is not added. You can't use it as an alternate unless you, it's not on the list yet. As technologies are retired from ILMT, you got to decide whether you're going to upgrade to an eligible technology or go full capacity. And this seems unfair in a way, because it's like, well, IBM doesn't tell me what operating system to use, but as they're timing out, like Windows Server 2008 and Windows 7, when they reach end of support on ILMT, you have 180 days to move to a supported operating system. So if you have like an archive server, that's some of those were the ones I've seen audit fails on, because it's like Windows 2000, Windows 2003. So if you are really dead set against upgrading that operating system, ask IBM for an exception and get it in writing to just do manual reporting, because ILMT will start ignoring them. And remember, when you get that written exception for manual reporting, remember to do it quarterly, because the exception isn't any good if you don't take the action you committed to. That's another assumption I've found, that people will say, I'm going to do this instead, and then they don't do it. Okay. There is a misconception that ILMT is easy, but I think that's mostly due to IBM talking about it rather than an assumption that their customers make. ILMT does not do everything out of the box. It can't recognize IBM software without, constant administrative action to keep pulling things in. It doesn't know what kind of licenses you have out of the box, so it's just going to report, and it doesn't know what metrics you have either, because it can't count up users or other license metrics. It's only specifically for IBM software on your servers that are being licensed with server-based metrics. In reality, ILMT needs somebody to set it up. It also needs updates to PVU tables in the software catalog. Somebody, when the report is generated, has to confirm it's accurate. And then it needs constant babysitting, because items that have been corrected 1 month can be a problem later again. Like let's say a VMware password changed. It no longer can see the physical host servers underneath it. So it might jack up the PVUs per core to 120 instead of the 70 you're used to. And usually you can catch that if you're looking from month to month or quarter to quarter. Hey, I now use 20,000 more PVUs. What happened? And then you look in the details and it's like, I see. Okay. Another assumption is that this sounds like a big pain in the butt to install ILMT. I gotta have somebody that's keeping an eye on it. I had to pay somebody out of my limited resources. But if you compare what the difference is between full and subcapacity, I used as an example one pretty huge server, but the difference between full capacity, where you license every core for a software title, as opposed to subcapacity, where you're only licensing, this is an IBM server, so they have LPARs. If you're only licensing the LPAR where it's running, it's a huge difference in the number of licenses and also the cost, because full capacity on this kind of server would be huge. But most people have smaller servers, but if you still have like 40 core servers in your environment in a big VMware farm, how many of them are actually running all those cores have WAS or MQ or data stage running on it, or a Tivoli product? And if you had a license for full capacity, it would be an extremely high number. The best scenario for if you choose to be full capacity is to be very diligent in using the best resources in virtualization and kind of grouping them together on the same server, like with like, or the same cluster. So you kind of curtail how many servers you need to license with full capacity. One assumption is I installed ILMT, it's good forever. Passport Advantage again says you should have the most current version. They're not as picky about this, but if you still have version 7.2 or 7.5 running, those were sunset in 2016. So they haven't been updating a lot of the tables for that. So it's almost like you're half blind trying to get reports out of it. And the initial version 9 was introduced in 2015. So it's best to kind of stay as most up to date as you can. And another assumption is it's too late. I've missed the ILMT train. And you can always go back to that Chinese proverb, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time? Now. ILMT has been available over 12 years. If you haven't installed it yet, do it now, because before you receive an audit letter, you can still discuss it. Okay, I don't have the 2 years of reports that I would need, but at least I did it before I got the audit letter. Give me a break, and they usually do. But if you do it after you receive an audit letter from IBM, that's as good as not having it at all, because then they think you have not been paying attention to where, your licensing responsibilities until you get an audit letter. And another assumption is with bundling. A lot of IBM's titles have a bundled or restricted version of another product bundled in with the parent product that you're licensing. And there's some limitations on the feature too, that you have to be careful that you're not turning on extra stuff, but you have to be careful that you're not using that restricted software for something other than its parent product to support it. And you also, the upgrades and patches for the bundled product are distributed as part of the parent product. Don't unalign versions, because that can lead to trouble. If you unalign the versions or something else, that could lead to needing a full software license. Let's say you like master data management includes data stage. If you install and said data stage work group, you need to install license data stage work group, because you're not using the right product. And versions are also listed. And there's IBM on their website will list what's included. Usually in the install package, you'll see everything in the instructions. But also when I'm trying to piece something together from an audit finding, if you leave it on the old version, I sometimes can figure out what went wrong, where I see old versions of WAS or DB2 or WebSphere portal server, and then I can suspect it's JD Edwards before Oracle owned it, or PeopleSoft. Because if someone downloads more recent versions that wasn't included in JDE or PeopleSoft, you need to buy a license, but you also, you're not covered by whatever agreement you had with the regular parent license. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Sharon. We had a couple questions come in. I can tell you a couple now are of the nature of the answer is going to be, it depends. And we don't want to let out any confidential information for some of you. If I don't get your questions, we're going to contact you directly after. The first one, Sharon, we got is an IBM had salesperson recently contacted us about having one of their partners managing our licenses for us. Is that a program that you recommend or you recommend against?
Well, there's IBM has the IASP program with the as a service provider that they've named 4 companies. KPMG and Deloitte are the ones that actually do the audits for them as a third-party independent auditor. And the other 2 are Englepoint and Ernst & Young. And that program, it could help if you have no idea what's going on with your licensing, but you will, instead of an audit where IBM pays them, you're going to be paying them, and you have to remain in that program, or you open yourself to an audit. And it also, they may not be, they may not suggest things that will reduce costs or cost avoidance or something that could help you, because even though you're paying them and you have an NDA and stuff, they are sharing some information with IBM, and it becomes a sticky situation. And sometimes, I mean, because IBM software is complex, it takes a lot of looking around and diving a little deeper and getting into the details that they may not completely do on their projects for you. Oh, and when I said remain in the program, is they do that initial review, and then you have an annual contract with them that you're supposed to keep renewing year after year. Now, I have heard, but I can't prove it, that IBM pays their auditors, KPMG or Deloitte, $250,000 for each audit they do for them. So that's one of the reasons why you, as the recipient of the audit, have to pay so much. They don't wipe it away. Just, if you have good excuses, you have good answers to them, you may not get off scot-free because they have to recoup that money. But the program is ongoing, and it's a continual review of your environment. So it may, and you, as part of it, you're also agreeing to buy all the licenses you're found short, rather than initially doing some changes that may reduce or eliminate those shortfalls.
And what happens a lot there is people install stuff by accident. People turn stuff on by accident. They're not even using it. And that's why we don't recommend against using this partner program this IASP partner program that IBM has. Instead, we recommend going with an independent third party like Miro, who can do a review of your environment. And then we tell you if there's any kind of problems. We don't report to IBM. We have a confidentiality agreement with all of our clients. So if you want a view of what your situation is without talking to IBM, again, we recommend independent third parties like Miro. We have another question. We have time for a couple more if anybody wants to put them in. Please use the question and answer box in your control panel. So this question is, the company I work for just went through an audit on Maximo. Would you have any suggestions on dealing with this again in the future?
Maximo is a good suggestion, and Cognos is similar because you have users assigned roles and modules. So it's something ILMT would never see or never track for you. So that tool is not helping you in this situation, but you almost have to kind of like, especially since you had an audit, you have the scripts to get the data out of the tool to see how many users are using each module. So you make sure you don't have X employees in there. You make sure that everything that you're using actually needs to be used if they have the right permissions. And with Cognos, it's the same thing, because sometimes everybody could be just granted admin rights. So it's something, and it could be they're never using it. And then you end up paying for licenses where people aren't using it. It's just they were granted too many permissions. So luckily, well, not so luckily in your case, that you had a problem with Maximo, but you can use that information going forward to keep on top of it, even if it's just checking on it quarterly like you would with other products in your environment, to make sure that there's not an excess of users there, or that users that move to different departments or are no longer with the company are taken out of the user pool.
Thanks, Sharon. And then we had a question is, so it's more cost effective to be proactive rather than waiting to be audited. Is that the right understanding? And I just can quickly answer that. Usually, yes, but with Miro, the answer is always yes. So unless you have your environment absolutely perfect, which, to be frank, no one really ever does, it is always safer to hire someone, an outside expert, to make sure that everything is exactly the way it should be according to the licenses you own. And with Miro, it is always actually the better option, because we have a performance guarantee, which says that our fees are directly related to any cost savings or avoidance we find. So our fees are always going to be less than the amount of cost savings and avoidance that we might uncover when we would do what we call essentially a friendly audit, making sure that your entitlements and licenses match up with what you're actually using. And with that, we're going to end the webinar now. Like I said, we have a few extra questions, but it's really of the it depends nature. So if you want to talk to us further, well, we'd be more than willing to speak with you one-on-one regarding your exact situation. Just contact us using the information on the screen, or you could email us at info@miroconsulting.com. Call us at 732-738-8511, extension 1208, or visit us on the web at miroconsulting.com. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.